Hello and welcome to a Knife Skills Masterclass, exclusively for The Telegraph. I'm Lisa Markwell, I'm the food editor at The Telegraph, and I'm joined by Mark Hix. We'll be getting to know Mark in a minute. In this hour-long session, we will be learning the tricks of the trade, need-to-know knife skills, from the basics right up to some really developed techniques which you'll master and they'll last you a lifetime. We'll also talk about which knives we should be using and how to look after them. To lead the masterclass, I'm delighted that we're joined today by Mark Hix. Mark is an award-winning, well-established chef. I'm sure you'll know he's written 12 cookbooks and he's had a string of restaurants across London and back in his home county of Dorset. As we go along through the session, we'll talk a bit about Mark's career, but he's loved particularly for his Telegraph column, which is fairly new, which he shows us from his home in Dorset, all sorts of menus, dishes, and meet the producers where the produce comes from, because we all know that everything delicious starts with great produce. But it also starts with great knife skills. Before we get started, I just want to mention this is a pre-recorded session, but I have got some questions from some of the readers to challenge Mark with, so I'll be dropping them in as we go along through the session. So, welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
We are here today, not in my kitchen or your kitchen, but in a lovely special kitchen for the Telegraph. We've brought with us, I've got a few knives, you've got your wonderful knives that you've collected over your long career, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But I just wanted to start off by saying, for the audience, it's important to have good quality knives. You can spend a lot of money on a knife, but if you want to sort of start with the basics, we've just got here, it's actually from ProCook, which is a great company that has good value knives. Perhaps you could just tell us a bit about what each one basically is.
So really, I mean, this always brings me back to my first day at catering college, and probably you, when you went to,
yes.
you know, you end up with a knife roll, which Lisa's got over there.
Here's one I made earlier.
And I still do have some of my old carbon steel knives, and you know, which actually sharpen really well, because you know, things moved on from carbon steel to stainless steel, but the problem with stainless steel is, you know, they're more difficult to sharpen once they go blunt, which sort of leads me on really to, you know, sharpening knives and which knives you use for.
We'll come on to sharpening, because I think you can talk about that with your own knives, and I'd love you to show me your techniques, because everyone has slightly different ones. But if any of our audience were to think, right, I'm going to get some new knives, mine have been rattling around in the kitchen drawer. You need something for different moments in the kitchen.
So I always say that, you know, if you buy a kitchen knife, it needs to be there for life. You know, you're not going to dispose of it after a year or two. So that means buy a good quality, heavy knife that sort of suits you. These are good basic knives, as you said. They remind me of my college knives, actually, the old Sabatier knives. And, you know, these are good general purpose. I mean, I've got dozens of different knives that I've collected and been gifted over the years. But I always find myself using the same 2 or 3 knives.
But just as a sort of, I guess, a refresher for people, and I think this is what most of us would like, is a serrated knife, which is great, obviously, for bread, and anything cake, anything like that. A sort of good long knife that you might use for boning, you know, that's a good long stroke knife. Yeah, so these are sort of multi-functional, carving, boning. I would even use that for filleting fish as well. And then that's a classic chef's knife, isn't it? That shape is just very good for rocking, and which we'll show you in a minute. An all-purpose knife, and that's a smaller version. And then something really small and that can get into all the nooks and crannies, paring. Even if you wanted to open an oyster, you might do that down in Dorset, that sort of thing. And then these are good knives, aren't they? Yeah, I mean, you know, the whole Japanese knife thing sort of took off. But unfortunately, a lot of people, and friends of mine even, ended up buying Japanese knives, which were sushi knives, which aren't suitable for European cooking. Because on the blade of a Japanese knife, maybe I'll show you also with these, like a sushi knife, you know, has only one angle, whereas a normal European knife for chopping is, you know, is sort of a V shape. So a lot of people, you know, unfortunately bought
the wrong, very expensive knives,
Oh dear.
which were for, you know,
I hope
cutting.
no one watching has made that
sushi,
mistake.
yeah.
Yes. But what's good about this, I mean, I use one like this at home a lot because if you can see the ridges on it. There's nothing more irritating than if you're cutting through something, it might be a cabbage or an onion or a tomato or whatever, and it sort of sticks to the knife, and then you end up with sort of things everywhere. But actually, because it's got these little sort of bevels, it actually means that what you're cutting sort of falls away. So that's quite a useful one that people might like.
Yeah, and I think people will collect, like I've done and you've done over the years, collect knives and then end up with using the ones that they feel comfortable with.
Yeah, it's about how it feels in your hand and all sorts of things. So that's a good sort of pro cook, I think, starting point. But I think first things first, show us what you do to prepare the surface that you're going to be cutting on.
Yeah, and also just one more thing on a knife. I mean, I would say, you know, on average, you know, probably spend 30 quid on a good knife, I'd say. You can spend 130, you can spend 200 quid. I did end up... I was doing that Taste of London thing once, and I forgot to bring my knives.
Oh no!
So I went to the Japanese knife shop, and I saw their eyes sort of light up, and I ended up buying that for 130 quid, like 15 or 20 years ago. But I still use it.
You're still using it, so yes. Yes, exactly. It can be an expensive game, and I was lucky enough to travel to Japan, and I went down. There's a road, I think it's even called Knife Street or Kitchen Street, and it's got all the knife shops, and I didn't really know where to start. I bought one very nice, that sort of shape and size.
Well, that one I actually made. So there's a knife maker called Alex Pole who operates out of this barn at Julienne down in Somerset. So I did a little knife thing with him, and I made my own knife, which is this one. And this is Julienne's applewood.
Oh, how beautiful.
But it started off that long. so when I'd lost concentration for a minute, and the end just snapped off.
Oh dear.
So I ended up with a much shorter knife, but it's quite a nice knife to have.
Losing concentration while handling knives is not
and
something.
It's
not something that
blacksmith's hammer.
We're not going to be doing that today.
No.
So I'm going to put away these my trusty knives, and we'll talk a little bit later as well about how you store knives and what you do with them when you're not cooking with them. So tell us, while I put these away, where do you keep your knives at home?
Well, I've got this clever wooden insert in my drawer at home, which has about 2 layers, and you can put all your different knives, your steak knives for the table, in there, and that just keeps all the blades separated. Some people will just chuck them in a kitchen drawer, which blunts them. And I always wash my knives by hand. A dishwasher's not going to blunt it, but if you pack them all together, obviously it will.
Yeah, we'll have a few do's and don'ts, I think, as we go along.
Yeah, or a knife block or a knife magnet.
Yes.
So there's different ways to store, but the main thing is keeping the blades separate.
Yes, because if you were to look at one very, very closely, any little chips and sort of imperfections, that does affect it, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so we're going to get to some chopping, but a crucial thing in any kitchen, here we're using an island, but whatever surface you're going to put your chopping board on, it's good for it to be secure. Yeah,
so before you start chopping, because the most dangerous things in the kitchen are a blunt knife and a wobbly chopping board, or a board that's going to slide around. So I always put a piece of damp paper or a damp cloth, or you can use those sort of rubber mat things that you can buy for lining drawers or non-slip. So, that, it's not going to go anywhere then. And a sharp knife.
Great. So we're going to talk you through some different techniques. Mark, you're going to show us, starting off with some vegetables, some herbs, some fruit. Then we're going to get into a little bit of light fish filleting and go on from there.
Yeah. We should probably start with the onion, which is the first thing I did at college.
That's the first thing that you learn, is the perfect way to cut an onion. And once you've learned it, it's an incredibly useful skill.
And also, once you've been taught to do it once, you never forget these things, because they'll just stick in your mind like, lots of stuff. So, you've got the root, which is important that you leave as much of that on as possible. So don't chop it off here, which I see a lot of people doing, because you'll see why later. So you chop it off just enough to sort of clean it and peel it. And then the top bit comes off.
I'm just going to go behind you just to have a little Let's have a waste bowl there.
Let's have a waste bowl.
Keep it clean.
And sometimes, if you've got onions that are really dry, just pop them in a bowl of water for a few minutes.
Oh, well, that makes the skin easier to come off.
Because, you know, sometimes you've had onions in your larder for a month or something, or in your fridge, and a bit of a...
Now, you're already using a technique that's something that a professional chef would use, but perhaps a home cook wouldn't necessarily use, which is to cut it in your hand.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, there's no other way really to do it. I mean, you could cut it in half.
Shall I show you?
First?
Yeah, that's how I would do it.
Yeah, okay.
Should we have an onion off?
Yeah, go on. We have a competition.
You'll be quicker than me, I can guarantee it.
Yeah, okay, so you cut it in half, yeah. Go on.
Not going to be able to
I'd
find
probably
the
do
knife
it
now.
this way because I'm chatting to people whilst I'm cooking. So I can...
Are you absolutely right? I mean, always keep the root in it. I would go down like that, through the root, and then peel, and carry on from there. So you carry on.
Either or. In fact, we haven't got a shallot, but there's a way to cut onions and shallots that you get taught from college. But what I might do is use half of your onion afterwards. And then,
afterwards,
that's all right, that's okay. So once you've peeled it, so you cut in half. Now, I've just been used to so many years using a big old knife like this, and everyone says to me, yeah, how can you chop things with a big knife? So I might just use a smaller one for this.
An all-purpose chef's knife, really, a kitchen knife that we would all have.
I mean, I've just got used to having, a heavy knife in my hand. So, and also people, I've seen people try to use a very small knife that isn't even as big as the onion. So I think a general rule of thumb is to use something that's actually bigger than the thing you're going to chop. So holding your knife, you should hold it quite lightly. You're not going to stab someone, hopefully. So I always find holding it and sort of guiding it with your finger a bit like this. Now, the first thing to do a finely chopped onion, I'm going to do half finely chopped and half sliced, is you make lots of cuts, not all the way through, but as far as you can towards the root. So...
And keeping your fingers sort of well tucked in.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to use my fingers as the guide, which scares the hell out of a lot of people. But, as long as you are confident. Because the thing is, if you try and do that, you're guessing.
Yeah.
So my finger is the guide, and I've not got too many scars. Thank God.
So nice uniform, thin.
Yeah, and you'll see that. I mean, there was another thing we learnt at college, and is to cut it through there, but...
I don't do that.
No, I've sort of, over the years, thought to myself, is it worth it or not?
Well, an onion, of course, has natural layers of its own, so if you want to make it into dice, which we're doing here, it is going to do it by itself because it's got the natural separation.
So what you then do is you sort of hold it back together, and then when you're chopping, it's always keep the toe, so you've got the toe and the heel of the knife. So always keep the toe of the knife on the board, because if you try doing this, the accuracy goes out the window, and doing that...
It's better for control, isn't it? Because you're not sort of moving your hand around, you're...
Yeah, so, you get instant finely chopped onions. Obviously, a shallot is going to be much smaller dice if you do it with a shallot. So, most recipes, whether you're making a casserole or stew or whatever, is going to call for finely chopped onions or sliced. If you need them even finer, then you can go over them, but that bruises the onion a bit and you may lose a little bit of flavour. But if you're going to cook them straight away, it's not.
Should we have a little tray to... Perhaps what we could do is put our...
We'll put our samples here.
Yeah. I mean, that's perfect. And if you're making risotto, for instance, onions like that are fantastic because in Italy, they would say that the onion should be the same size as the grains of rice.
Yes,
which
exactly.
sounds incredibly daunting, but actually, with that technique, you're pretty much there.
Yeah. So basically, you'll just carry on right the way back. You're always going to end up with a little bit at the end.
Yeah.
You can easily. So what I normally do with that bit at the end, rather than throw it in the bin, I then go around and just cut it a bit more, and then you can just go around so you don't waste anything. Or if you're making a stock, you can use it in a stock.
And of course, in a restaurant kitchen, we'll try to keep waste to an absolute minimum. Use every part of everything.
Otherwise, you get a serious bollocking.
Well, you're not allowed to say that, but you get told off by the head chef. I was also taught that if you are doing exactly what you're doing now, or if you're scraping your chopped onions into something, to use the back of the blade so you don't dull the knife. So if you were to be pushing those into your saucepan, because you're trying to sort of keep the blade
And there's lots of practical things. I see people that if their saucepans over there, for example, scooping it up and trying to carry it. But actually, what you need to do is either bring the saucepan to the board and skip it off, or take the board to the saucepan.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a lot of common sense things. I'm just going to show that other method. And I was watching a girl in the kitchen that was working for me one day, and she was doing shallots. And I'd never actually seen it before. And it doesn't work as well with onions because they're much bigger. But let's pretend this was a shallot.
Okay.
And what she was doing was separating the leaves like this. I was I didn't say anything to her, I just watched. And, she was doing this. And then she'd turn it round and do it like that, which actually does make a lot of sense, and it steers away from the classic way that we were taught. But,
Yes, they're beautifully chopped.
Yeah. So I didn't say anything. I said, good idea, I use that in the future.
I mean, let's say, as you say, if you're starting a pasta sauce with onions, celery, and carrots, that technique of chopping the onion is absolutely perfect because they're all going to be a uniform size. That's fantastic. But they're not visible. No one's going to go through their pasta sauce at the end and look at the size of the onions. It's really for cooking everything uniform.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you were doing, I don't know, a little mignonette, little sort of diced shallot to put on top of something and you could see it, it's nice to have it really beautifully uniformly chopped, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, when I was a very young commis chef working at the Grosvenor House, the chef de partie or head chef or sous chef would put a couple bags of shallots in front of you, but they were the little tiny shallots in those days, not those big banana ones. Anyway, so I remember watching it wasn't me, but it used to scare the hell out of me because there was a colleague of mine who didn't get them quite fine enough, and the head chef come along and took the chopping board and scooped them all into the stock pot. And then brought them another bag of shallots.
The most offensive thing that you can do is reject someone's hard work.
Yeah, so that I was always conscious about that.
Yes.
And I'd always tell that story because...
Now I'm going to come behind you here and we're going to move on to a carrot.
I'm just going to do the sliced onion.
Yes, so I'm going to peel the carrot while you're doing that.
So to slice onions, for example, if you're going to make French onion soup or an onion gravy, you start with your half onion, you take out the root, because the root is the thing that's going to hold them all together, and you'll end up with lots of little, quite nice shaped things. And then what you do is you cut along the grain, so the grain of the onion is going that way. And then again, you just slice. Now, a lot of people slice it the other way, but I've always found if you're cooking them down in a bit of butter, they don't sort of when you cut them this way, they tend to sort of distribute in a pan a bit more.
Yes.
I find the other way they sort of tend to keep their
yes, because that's what you want,
shape.
Is them all to be lovely separate sort of strands or petals or whatever. Making it look very easy, Mark.
Well, it's only easy because I've been doing it for a long time.
But with these techniques, you will definitely, as we were saying, once you've done onions like this, I think it is a technique you'll use for life.
Yeah, and I think you don't forget it. And I think if you want to practice, you know, slicing and finely chopping, make a soup or something. Make onion soup or make a sauce or whatever. And just to get the, you know, the rhythm going on a knife. But you know, this knife, you know, all knives do different things, I think. You know, weight is important. Light, flimsy knives don't work. And this particular one has got a really good sort of rocking action.
Yeah. And then also, if you've got a good knife and you've learned how to use it, as you say, you don't need to grip it so hard.
No.
Because that's when accidents can happen as well, when your arm is tense and your hand is tense.
Yeah.
You know, you're putting too much pressure on. Imagine you're cutting an onion, if you're pushing that hard and the knife slips, you're pushing with that amount of tension into your fingertip or something.
So
you
that
don't
sort
want.
of grip, I mean, it's a bit, I played golf when I was a kid, and that's the same grip almost. Because my...
I'll take your word for it.
My teacher earlier said, you know, don't hold the club too tightly. Just hold it like you're holding a little tiny bird or something, so you're not going to crush it.
Okay,
So
it's not a tiny bird, it's a carrot.
It is.
So let's move on to carrots.
So, sort of back to my college days, I suppose, again, the first thing you did before you even started cooking, you had to do the basic cuts, which in French were called Macedonian, Julienne, brunoise, all meant different things. But for simple terms, it's finely diced, it's shredded, and it's roughly diced, if you like, if you're going to make a minestrone. So we're going to replicate those cuts. The first one is Julienne, which is very fine strips that you could use. What would we use Julienne for? Fish on papillote, maybe?
Yeah, something like that. Or if you were having a sort of pretty sort of Asian salad or something like that, really
or
nice.
Asian soup. Or,
if you're doing a sort of green papaya salad, one of those things where you've got lovely sort of strands of the vegetables, or celeriac, remoulade, something like that, lovely.
Exactly.
And we will talk about mandolins and other ways of slicing.
Yeah, so, you know, we didn't ever use a mandolin really at college, but we would have to do it by hand to get those skills. So chop the first bit off so you've got a... That's
a key thing, isn't it?
Otherwise,
ideally you want a flat surface.
It's welding around a bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
So with the onion, cutting it in half, you already got a flat surface so that thing's not going to slip. Same with a carrot, a potato, an apple.
I've got lots of horror stories, I'm sure.
And we don't want the horror stories, thank you, Mark. We want you to cut the carrot.
Right, so what we do first is slice them as thinly as possible.
I'm just going to check on the oven.
Oh, yes. My lunch is in the oven. So, once you've done your slices, so we're going to get 2 different cuts out of this. So the first cut is the Julienne. And this is really a satisfying thing to do, I think. So what you do then, once you slice them, you then shred them as thin as you can.
Well, so matchsticks is really, aren't they? Even thinner than matchsticks, really.
Yeah. So, you know, you've got these nice little shreds like that. And then from that cut, you can then cut a brunoise, or very fine dice.
And again, if you're doing something with carrots and onion and celery or something else together, what you're doing with your carrot there is making it pretty much the same size as the onion.
Exactly.
So things will cook at the same speed. They will look nice in the mouth if you are biting into them. Everything's like for like. That's very petit brunoise.
Isn't it just? That's the only way I learned. Any bigger, it would go in a stock pot.
My goodness. Now, we've got a question just as we're going along, because we'll talk about the questions. We've got one from Claire in Newbury, and actually I think a few people asked versions of this. How often how often should she says, sharpen her knives?
Right, good question. So you should sharpen your knife really every time that you use it. So most people think that you sharpen the knives when they go blunt, which is a no-no. So either, if I've done, all these onions and carrots, before I put it back in the knife drawer and cleaned it, I would sharpen it. So either with one of these, which does make life easier, because the problem with an old-fashioned steel...
Yeah, that's what I would use.
Yeah, so you would and I would, because we've been trained. Because if you use a steel, the angle has to be spot on. I've seen people try and do that and all sorts of
Sometimes people,
things.
do this very performative.
It doesn't do anything apart from probably blunt the knife. So you have to go down, and that's why this guard is here. It's a safety guard. So you're making strokes down towards your hand, but you're not going to hit your hand like that. But again, if you're not comfortable...
I'll just show you my technique before we move on with the steel. So I'd have a damp tea towel.
Yes, that's another way.
I would hold it down like that to avoid lacerating my hand. And then you can see the angle, and then I would do it like that. So that you're not, and you can sort of see what you're doing. But you've got a really handy gadget, which is someone who uses knives all day, every day. Talk us through what you use and why, because you brought it with you.
Yeah, so these things, there are good quality ones and not so good quality. But, the angle is pre-set.
Right.
So at home, because that's the angle you want to sharpen at home you just draw these through just a couple of times.
Wow.
And it puts a really good edge and it's no effort.
I'm going to get you to do all my knives before we finish today. That's wonderful.
So at home, I'd recommend that to keep your knife sharp. I wouldn't recommend a steel unless you were experienced. Really.
So those are things that you can find in shops. And that's sharpening a knife, but that's different to honing a knife, isn't it? We're going to move on to our next. What would you like to do next?
Well, shall I do the same cut with the dangerous item?
No, we'll come on to that if we've got time. We're talking about knives, so we've got a gadget that if we have time, but I'm conscious we're talking about which is a mandolin. But what about tomatoes?
Tomatoes,
because
yes.
to get the best from a tomato, and of course we know tomatoes are fruit. It's a slightly different knife, isn't it?
Well, yes.
Wouldn't you? I would. I use a fruit.
I would use the same old knife but these are good because I find that these little serrated, because they're called a tomato knife, aren't they? They are not very expensive. They're almost disposable, so when the serratedness goes out.
Yes, that was a question we had. There was I can't find her. Marjorie in Somerset, near to you, said that she's got an old beloved bread knife, which of course has a serrated edge, and it's pretty blunt and sort of useless. She says, can it be sharpened? Serrated knives.
So I think if that happens,
I would say for something like this, get a new one.
Yeah, get a new one, or if you don't want to throw it in the bin, go to a hardware store and get it ground so that it becomes like
a flat blade. Yeah. Oh, that's a good tip. Yeah. Okay, so serrated knife is good for fruits and sort of softer produce, really, isn't it?
Yeah, so, this knife is perfect for slicing.
Because I think we've all cut tomatoes and it just end up leaning on it and sort of squashing it and the whole thing sort of splays.
So, you can cut them as thin as you want if you want to do a sliced tomato salad.
Lovely.
The other thing that is a lot of recipes will have diced tomato or tomato concasse. Which is, you would quarter it, cut or squeeze the seeds out, but let me just do this one. Now at college, we were taught to blanch the tomatoes, but depending in boiling water to get the skin off. But, later in life, you learn all these things, and you can actually, if you quarter it like that, and it doesn't soften the tomato, you can just go...
But this is sort of professional level. I personally wouldn't peel my tomatoes before I put them in a salad.
No, I wouldn't
But if you
either.
wanted to do something really special, that's lovely because then...
Because some recipes say peeled tomatoes and everyone thinks it's peeled tomatoes. Or if you don't want to peel it, as Lisa just said, you can just dice them up.
And it's good to cut from the skin side rather than to cut down to the skin, is it?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
As long as your knife's sharp.
Okay, lovely.
So, yeah. But again, depending on what you're going to do, if a recipe calls... So for a pasta sauce, for example, you know, I would leave the seeds in. So
Yes.
if you're making a pasta sauce with fresh tomatoes, I would just do that.
Yeah.
Why, you know, because why waste all of those?
Yes, and that's where a lot of the
Seeds.
juices...
Yeah, because if you put a can of chopped tomatoes in, you get seeds. don't you?
Yes.
So
Wonderful.
that's perfectly good for
Yeah. Yeah.
anything like that, really.
And we're coming into a brilliant English tomato season
Yes.
soon, and they are so versatile and lovely. Now, let's do a little light...
What should we do next?
Should we do some herbs?
Let's do some herbs.
There we
Now,
are.
no one, including catering college, really teaches you how to chop parsley, because we used to use one of those rocking...
Oh, yes.
What are they called again? Hachoir, it was called.
Oh,
Everything was in French.
I don't know what that was
It
called.
was called a...
I think everybody knows that you see them. They're sort of you quite often get them double bladed, don't you? So it's a
Yeah.
mezzaluna in
Oh, that's
Italian.
it. That's it.
Still not English, but
So, and the other thing I really dislike is people think that herbs, you should discard all the stalks.
yes,
So I constantly see, even at work, you know, people discarding the stalks. But if you're making a lot of dishes, you know, I would, especially coriander, you know, I would finely chop those stalks, you see.
shall I take the beef out of the oven while we?
Oh, yes, go on. Let's give it a prod, shall we?
You carry on with your herbs.
Okay. So, yeah, don't waste the stalks. Shall I put them on Lisa's board over there?
This is hot, so we've got some beef here that we thought we might show you later. Ready?
Yep. People now are going to say, how do you know it's ready?
We'll come on to that.
Yeah. So, you know, if you're making a fish stock or a stock, you can sort of tear the stalks off and put them in there for flavour. Otherwise, if I'm going to finely chop parsley, I gather it up in a bunch like this, which saves a lot of time and it gets the job done a bit quicker. So I gather it in a bunch, shred it as finely as possible. Now, different, you know, different dishes call for different types of parsley cuts. You know, if you want it very, very, very fine, then that's okay. But I always find that actually, you know, why would you get it so fine as we were always taught? It's almost like powder. I mean, that is just cut once.
Yes,
Now, if you do want it finer, then you just go
you can do the
that way. But that's, for me, that's enough. That's done.
Yeah. It's to garnish a dish, which is what
Yeah.
we often use herbs for.
Yeah.
You want them finely diced so you don't have a great mouthful of parsley or coriander
Yeah,
or whatever.
and
But
then
you
you-
also want to sort of have some sense of what it is rather than, as you say, just a
Yeah.
green powder.
Exactly, and I think a lot of when you use parsley, you want to get the flavour out of it, but sprinkled on top doesn't really do it for me because you don't get the flavour. It needs to just, whether it's in amongst your new potatoes or a soup or a sauce, I like to just infuse it for a minute or so.
Let's have a. I'm going to put it in the bowl here.
Okay. You see that?
You talked earlier about not bruising things by cutting them, and with herbs that's very much the case, isn't it?
Yeah.
With basil, you notice sometimes if it's a blunt knife or someone's gone over it, overworked it, it starts to look grey. It starts to look bruised.
Chives, especially.
Yeah.
You know.
So just cut once with confidence.
Once, yeah.
And then. Brilliant.
So we've covered that. That's what I was saying earlier about people.
Yes. Have the bowl near the. Would you like to do an orange or a lemon? 'Cause
Yes. Let's do an orange.
Let's do an orange. I've got some giant oranges today. I went and thought, if we're going to have a stunt orange, let's have a good sized one.
So, a little clean down. Now working tidily and organised is very important. You know, I'm sure you've seen your mates, colleagues, they would leave the parsley on the board and carry on doing the orange, and they may well have done some garlic early on.
Yes, and actually keeping the kitchen tidy as you go means that you're less likely for a knife to fall off the corner of the table onto the floor.
I bet you've had a gin and tonic that tasted garlic.
I have had a gin and tonic that tasted garlic. And we'll come on to this in a minute when we move on to meat, you must use different chopping boards for different things, particularly if you're handling something like raw fish or raw meat.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
a good clean down is important as you go along, and actually just have more than one chopping board.
Yeah.
It's important. If you're using
or
garlic,
you can flip it over.
You can flip it over. Right.
Because some people have only got one chopping board. And whilst we're on the subject of chopping boards, those flimsy things that are plastic, they don't do it for me, really.
No.
Because they warp in the heat and they're not very stable. And in fact, a lot of those plastic boards will make the knife really quite blunt.
Yes.
So the idea of wood, and I've never had a plastic board at home, is you're never going to blunt your knife because it will sink into the...
Yeah. And wood is actually very hygienic, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's actually completely fine to use wood. When you see butcher's blocks, when you think they're cutting raw meat the whole time, they're actually very hygienic because the wood is
alive.
Naturally alive. I have to say, just on chopping boards, for me, the crime of the century is, and sometimes you get them if you rent a cottage, is a glass chopping board. And that's just... difficult to deal with. So sometimes I take my own chopping board.
Yeah. Who invented the glass chopping board?
Right.
So, grapefruits, oranges, lemons, all the same method. So, first thing you do, and again, I wouldn't, a medium knife. Let's say a medium knife. So, top and bottom off. And then we're going to cut just enough. After you've taken the first bit off, then you sort
what you're looking for, if you want to serve oranges in a salad or in a fruit salad, or you're poaching them or anything like that, you want to get rid of course, all the pith and the white, slightly bitter stuff. So this is a way just to end up with a fruit or a lemon for your gin and tonic or whatever you want to use it for, that keeps the deliciousness of the fruit and trims away all of the bitter.
And you can even do your own orange juice at home by doing this. You just blend the whole thing up, which is quite nice, because a lot of juicers, you end up with a lot of this stuff in the juicer, but if you put this in a good blender or a NutriBullet, you'll end up with a...
So you're just following, with the knife, you're just following the curve of the orange, more or less, And
then you can flip it over any bits you've missed. Now, a few years ago, I started just, every morning squeezing my orange juice. And all the shells I'd put in the compost or the bin. But what I do now is I have a bag in the freezer and I put all the orange shells after I've juiced it in the freezer. And when I get a kilo, I make a batch of marmalade.
Brilliant idea.
Which comes out great because, there's so many different complicated... And the method I use, I just boil the skins in water. And when they're tender, you then...
as you would with any marmalade.
Strain it and you then shred your orange skins, which are already cooked. Put your sugar in, and it's a very quick way and a waste-free way to make
I stand
marmalade.
corrected. Thank you. That is an additional free tip for us.
You can put those wherever you want.
Well, not today.
Not today, but it's just a tip.
That's a very good tip.
Would,
yeah. Brilliant.
I think I might have mentioned that in the very first column of the steamed marmalade pudding. I think I might have mentioned it. Okay, so what we then do to get the segments, as you can see, you've got your guidelines already. So you're just going to go through. And of course, depending what you're going to use them for, Florida cocktail, grapefruit and orange.
I mean, this is the difference, I think, when you see things like a fruit salad or a fruit garnish in a restaurant and you see an orange segment like that and it's got no pith and it's just beautiful, pure fruit, you know, you think, why doesn't mine look like that at home? And actually, it is just taking a little bit of time. It's very quick just to take out the membrane, you know, the separate bits, and just end up with lovely fruit.
It's like most things, you know, if you work in an organised fashion and you take your time doing your prep.
Yeah.
And then you can squeeze your juice onto there, or to put it in your pot in the freezer for your marmalade. Now, once you've done your segments, of course, then there's lots of other uses. I mean, I quite often make, in the blood orange season, I will chop up my blood oranges and use it for ceviche.
Lovely.
Like that. But that's good with any fish, really. I mean, you do that with a bit of the juice, chopped coriander and chilli. Perfect for just putting on some raw fish or
Lovely.
tossing on.
So that's a quick starter for fruit. Now we're going to move on to fish. So if you will answer a question for me while I get the fish out.
I will.
How much, this is Ed in London, and I'm sure he's not alone, would like to know what's the most that you spent on a knife. I know you said you had the emergency knife that you had to buy for £130, but just talk a little bit about how much you've spent and how much it's possible to spend.
Yeah, so that's the most I spent because, you know, the good thing in the hospitality business is you get sent lots of samples. And of course, then when you start writing for a newspaper, you start getting sent even more samples.
Mackerel good?
Yeah.
Or lemon sole?
No, mackerel's good. And, you know, and these people start sending you books and stuff, and, you know, it's... so you end up with lots of stuff.
So I got today for Mark to show you some fish filleting and how to use a fish knife, some mackerel, which is obviously something that Mark has used a lot in his recipes. I'm sure you will have seen them or maybe eaten in one of his restaurants. Fish is a big speciality for him. These are lovely, super fresh mackerel. And if you buy fish whole, it's sort of then you can decide how you want to use it. And I think a lot of people are nervous about whole fish, but actually they shouldn't be, because like as we were just showing with the orange, there are guidelines. There's you know, sort of some of it's done for you.
And the good old mackerel, I more often than not would just grill them whole, barbecued, hot oven, whatever. And if you want to fillet it, because mackerel are quite cheap, well, they are at the moment, the best fish to practice your filleting on would be something like a mackerel.
Okay.
Because then if you do mess it up, you can then make a mackerel and orange ceviche.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Now, I've got a sort of, as you were saying earlier, a kind of bendy, that's the sort of size knife that I would use, but there was a bigger
which one I use, don't you?
You use the same one, don't you?
Yeah, or
but
slightly longer.
A bit of bend is a good thing.
Yeah,
Obviously, you don't want that for carving.
No.
Or if you're doing boning, but with a fish, you want to be able to sort of move around the bones.
Yeah, especially when you get stuck into a bigger fish like a sea bass, or if you're filleting a flatfish.
Right.
But small flatfish, I'd prefer to cook on the bone.
Okay.
Really, because a lot of people say, "Oh, I don't cook fish at home because it's really difficult to cook." But actually, if you just roast the fish on the bone in a very hot oven, what can be simpler? A bit of oil, salt and pepper, a bit of herbs at the end. So, here we go. You don't need to take the guts out, but it does make it slightly easier.
I'll get a bowl ready to get the... I didn't realise it still had the guts in, so we've got additional excitement now.
There's one here.
Oh.
So, just along there. It just, by taking the guts out first. Sometimes on bigger fish, I leave the guts in because it keeps the shape of the body, like a sea bass, for example.
And actually, I mean, not everywhere has a fishmongers anymore in town, depending on where you live.
Right.
I mean, some of the big supermarkets do still have fish counters, but they are disappearing.
Yeah,
but we're seeing a bit of a boom, certainly through lockdown, of people being able to order fish direct from fishermen or direct from coastal fishing companies, which has been fantastic because actually, even if it's frozen, it would have been caught and frozen in peak condition, and that can be better than something that's been on the fishmongers or been transported to the supermarket over days and days. So don't be afraid to sort of find something which will send you fish direct, because you probably end up with a better product. Not everyone has a fish shack on their doorstep like you.
Don't, no.
So let's talk about the mackerel.
So if I've been out fishing, and I quite often might fillet some mackerel on the boat, whilst they're still moving around slightly. So if I'm doing it myself really quickly, I will do this and do that. Right? But only because I've been doing it for a long time. Now, at home...
You'll have to tell us what you're doing as you're doing it. So
at home, you might want to take your time a bit and then cut the head off, which makes it slightly easier. But because the bones on a mackerel are quite soft, this particular fish, you can do it from this side and your knife will go straight through the bones. Now, there's a reason knives aren't all the same length. So when you're doing something like this, a bit like if you're sawing a piece of wood, you know, if you use the length of the knife, you can't even hear it going through the bones, really.
So you're giving yourself the space to be able to move the knife around, and you're not getting to the end of the knife.
Yeah. Now, on a bigger fish like a sea bass, is that the mackerel? Somewhere?
Yes. Tell us about the bones that you've got left there.
So the bones in the mackerel here, you just need to take these ones off. Here, which is the belly bones.
So by trimming that down into a nice fillet, you're doing two things at once. You're getting rid of the bones, and you're ending up with a nice shaped fillet that's just ready to cook.
Yeah. Now, these bones down the middle, you can even... Got any tweezers in your handbag?
I might have some of my chef kit. Actually, I don't think I do.
You can either just say use a pair of tweezers and pull them out. Or another quick way, because the bones only go down to about there. Another quick way, and you won't notice, is you just cut a little V. You're not wasting anything, and you're not messing up your tweezers. You just cut that central bone out with a little V.
Great.
And you wouldn't know the difference.
It's a much quicker way, isn't it? It's much quicker than you going through and individually trying to feel for each bone. And that V cut to take out central bones is good with lots of fish, isn't it? It's just a really easy way just to remove a whole row of bones. And of course, all these, well, not the guts, but something like this, if you wanted to make fish stock, you've got a nice...
Yeah, I mean, you know, people say you can't make fish stock with mackerel bones, but you can. I've made a lot of Asian broths with this, but what I do is I just bring the cold water up to the boil and then make your stock as normal. And what I quite often do, if I've got a mackerel, before I fillet it, I'll cut the tail off. So imagine that's still got some meat on it. And I deep fry the tail crispy and put it in the broth.
Lovely.
So you've got a lovely sort of gingery, chilli, coriander broth with a deep fried tail sticking in there.
That's a very sort of bit of a stargazy pie meets something different. Now, I'm completely losing track of time because it's so interesting. We haven't got masses of time left,
okay.
But we've got this lovely fish fillet.
Yeah, so just very quickly, I mean, you can pan fry these, you can bake them in the oven. My gran used to roll them up and souse them. So that there would always be a pot of... I used to go and catch the mackerel, come back with a bag full, and she used to fry them whole. They used to sort of cut... Well, actually, no, she used to cut them like a kipper, you know, go straight through and open them out. And they used to sort of curl up in the pan because they were so fresh. And then the day after, she'd do a lot of soused mackerel like that with a cocktail stick, vinegar, carrots, onions.
Yeah, that sort of pickling and preserving is very popular now, isn't it?
Yeah, and I still do it on the menu to this day using Sarson's vinegar instead of, you know, some other fancy vinegar.
Now, I feel that we should probably, because we haven't got lots of time left, just talk a little bit about if you're using your knives for cooked meat, for carving, because quite a few people ask me about, well, carving knives, and is it worth having, I mean, I think I know the answer to this one, worth having an electric carving knife, or what knife would you use for carving? And also lots of people want to know about steak cookery and beef, and you know, when you go to restaurants and sometimes you see the sort of steak cut around the bone. So we've cooked a bit of beef. So perhaps first of all...
Yeah, so we've got a rib of beef, which, you know...
I'll bring it over here.
Yeah, so for me, you know, rib eye was the thing, but actually a rib of beef like this, which I think, you know, is easy to get in a butcher shop. It keeps it nice on the bone, it presents much better, and a really quick way to present that. I did have a little board earlier.
I'll get it. You talk about the beef.
Okay. So if you buy this, cook it on the bone, that's taken probably 25 minutes in the oven, was it? 20, 25? Yeah, something like that. Minutes, that will serve about 3 people. Probably weighs about 800 grams to a kilo. Now what I would do, and we do this in the restaurant.
So here you're using a sort of good...
Yeah, the same one I use for the mackerel.
Yeah.
But actually it's perfect because it's long.
Yes, you want a long, straight blade for this, for you cutting cooked meat. So if you were carving your Sunday roast or even your chicken, whatever, you want a nice, non-flexible, long blade.
And not a serrated knife because that will tend to tear it a bit. And then, you know, this is a perfect cut for Sunday roast. So if you get your rib on the bone, you know, without all that sort of strap of fat and stuff at the back, this is a much more economical. It might seem a bit more expensive, but it's not actually, because you've got pure meat. So either for a little Sunday roast, if there's only a couple of you, or as a dinner party thing,
you're going to
doing a
serve it
couple
on
of
that,
those.
aren't you? It's just as well as not smell-o-vision because my mouth is watering. That's beautiful. That's a lovely way to serve beef, isn't it? It's fantastic.
So if you're doing it, I mean, and that is quick and it's easy. You can make a green sauce with like a salsa verde with capers and parsley and basil, you know, which is dead simple in the blender, which is a perfect accompaniment, or mustard or both.
Great. And what you did there with the cutting the meat, and let's say it was a steak, if it was a smaller sirloin steak or something like that, it's important, is it not, the sort of direction that you cut through something like a steak?
Yeah, sort of.
Do you want to cut across the grain?
Yeah, so I've cut it against the grain, which means when that's on your plate, you're then carving it with the grain.
Ah, yes, makes sense. Thank you. This is like Galloping Gourmet for anyone old enough to remember. You'll have to talk with your mouth full.
I swallowed it already. So we've covered simple fish, we've covered vegetables. Should we do a chicken?
I think we've got time to quickly do a chicken. Jointing a chicken is something I'm really
Well, people
keen on
watching this
learning.
can do it in slow motion. I'll do it fairly quickly and then people can
Okay.
slow down their video.
Because, of course, if you buy a whole chicken, it's more economical. You'll find that actually it's a lower price. We've all got to be mindful of cost these days. But also a whole chicken, you can get the bits that you want, but you're left with the carcass, which you can make stock with. You're, you know, if you want the skin on, you want the skin off. If you want to bone the pieces, you can do all of that. But a really good sort of first technique is to start with a whole chicken and just break it down into those. I mean, traditionally you get 8 portions, don't you, out of a chicken?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just going to show you actually how you can use a whole chicken to your advantage at home. Because people just tend to buy legs, breasts, wings ready done. But actually, if you eat chicken on a regular basis, it makes sense to buy the whole bird. And then the bits and pieces that you're not going to serve that day, you can put them in the freezer in separate bags, which is what I do. and use them another time. So the first one is to get the legs off. So holding the leg, often if you do this, you use the weight of the bird, and it almost just snaps off there.
I mean, that's the thing with a chicken, or if you had a big piece of lamb, or I mean, when you see butchers doing it, they make it look like incredibly easy. But a lot of it's natural joins. You know, whether it's a joint of a bone or something. There's actually natural guidelines there, as you've just demonstrated.
And then the wings, I always like to sort of stockpile my wings in the freezer. If you hold it like that and cut around, there. And then with the back of your knife, just cut it, I don't know if you can see there. Just break it there, pull that off, which gives you that nice presentation bone for the next cut.
Gosh, I did not know that. That's very, very useful. I'm always reminded at times like this of a book that the great Faye Mashler, a restaurant critic, wrote. It was her first book, and it was called Cooking is a Game You Can Eat. And this reminds me of that. It's you know, with a little bit of confidence and some practice, it's actually really good fun and so satisfying, isn't it? When you...
And also try and buy it with the offal inside, the neck and the livers and the hearts, because then that's another dish you can stockpile. So if you want to just do the breasts for whatever dish you've got in mind.
So you've just gone down one side of the breastbone
there. The point of the knife.
Turn your chicken around a little bit so we can see.
Yeah, use your fingers, which you can then sort of almost pull it away.
So you're just going sort of around the bone there, just around the carcass, aren't you?
Yeah. And then we're going to keep that little bone on because it's always nice for presentation. Like that.
Chicken supreme, is that? Is that what they call that?
Yeah. And then, normally if I get a big chicken for whatever reason, I take out the little fillets. Because
the breast actually sort of has two fillets, doesn't it?
Yeah,
There's mini fillets, they call them in supermarkets.
These fillets here, which again you can use for another dish. You can put those in the freezer and make chicken satay or something, or little.
Oh yes, perfect for that, little skewers. Yes.
So chicken wings for whatever, barbecued.
Yeah, just with a marinade. It was perfect in the summer, isn't it? Marinade chicken wings.
And then I always separate the thighs and the legs.
This is another reason to keep the knives sharp, is so that you can. A chicken bone isn't too hard to cut through at all.
No. And then I normally cut the knuckles off and push down that little bone. Now, it's quite nice. I've recently started, because I do my kitchen tables at home. You can't buy a cockerel anymore to make coq au vin.
No.
So I quite often buy the drumsticks or the legs, and I do exactly that and get some cheapish red wine and marinate them for maybe 2 weeks in the fridge.
2 weeks?
Because it almost cures the meat as well. And then you do like a nice little mini coq au vin with a bit of mashed potato.
Oh, I love coq au vin. And actually the dark meat has so much flavour, and that's...
Yeah, so this is the nearest thing that you'd get to a kind of cockerel. Or you can make it into chicken curry or whatever. So, you know, there's lots of different cuts there, plus, of course, the bones that you mentioned.
Yeah. That
you can make a stock. So you can either stockpile your carcasses in the freezer or make the stock and freeze the stock.
And, you know, you're sort of doing what a butcher would do, and of course the butchers get to keep all the carcasses, but if you do it yourself, you know, you're saving money, and you're making, as you say, so many more dishes for yourself.
There you've got, you know, depending how many you're feeding, you know, if you've got 4 people, you've got 2 chickens, you know, you've got 1 meal there, another meal there, another meal there, stockpile those, That's a little barbecue snack or
Who doesn't love a barbecue snack? We have had an hour of Mark's time. Thank you, Mark, so much for joining us today.
And I've had to come back to London.
TT's come from Dorset to London for today's event. You've taught us some brilliant tips and tricks, which are learn it once, maybe practice a few times, and you'll use the techniques over and over again, as Mark does and I do. Hopefully, you'll impress your guests with your petit brunoise or your beautiful orange segments, and you've got some thrifty ideas for meat. Thank you very much for watching. Good night.
Thank you.